The Aaron Rodgers era is about to end in New York, and there are some lessons the Jets can take from the failure that was Aaron Rodgers' tenure with the Jets. We'll discuss them today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 10th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Of course, the big news in the NFL yesterday was Super Bowl 59, but the Jets also provided some major news. It was Jay Glazer of Fox Sports who reported that the Jets have spoken with Aaron Rodgers and informed him he will not return to the team in 2025. Rodgers is not part of the team's plans going forward. And when you think back to the Rodgers tenure, it was an unequivocal failure for the New York Jets. This trade will go down as one of the worst in franchise history, one of the least fruitful in franchise history. There are lots of lessons the team can take from this. And today's show, I'm going to give you three big picture lessons that the Jets should take going forward based on the failure that was the Aaron Rodgers trade. And the first lesson, I think, is the limits of one player in the NFL. If you go back 2 years, the Jets got it into their heads that they were Aaron Rodgers away from going to the Super Bowl. The team was coming off a 7-10 season. Now, the defense was very good, and there were some very promising young players on this team. In fact, there still are. Those young players who are promising are still on the team. But the Jets got themselves into the mindset that all they needed was Aaron Rodgers to go to the Super Bowl. And what preceded was one of the worst off seasons I can remember the Jets having. That was the 2023 offseason. And essentially the reason it was so bad was that the Jets, again, got it into their minds. Aaron Rodgers was it. That was it. That was their ticket to the Super Bowl, and nothing else they did mattered. So what did the Jets do? They essentially burned the entire offseason waiting to try and trade for Rodgers. They essentially were willing to pay any price. They set no limits on the focus of acquiring Rodgers. And I think there are a couple things that need to be said. First is that every single player has a price where they make sense and a price where they don't make sense. But beyond that, you have to set boundaries. The New York Jets allowed the trade for Aaron Rodgers to essentially dominate an entire offseason. And this impacted the team in many ways. The first way is that the Jets just made a lot of moves that did not pan out. The Jets did not address their offensive line in the offseason. The Jets needed to address their offensive line because it frankly wasn't very good at that point. The Jets made a lot of very suspect moves as a result of the acquisition of Rodgers. I mean, part of the reason they hired Nathaniel Hackett in the first place to be their offensive coordinator. Now, I don't think it's the only reason, but part of the reason they hired Nathaniel Hackett was he was Rodgers' preferred coordinator. And the Jets, I think, were trying to kind of lure Rodgers. The Jets were trying to make themselves more attractive to Rodgers by hiring a coach that Rodgers really likes, instead of just hiring the best coach out there. They should have had confidence. We hire the best coach out there, we'll become much more attractive to Aaron Rodgers. The Jets went out and signed Allen Lazard because he's one of Rodgers' favorite targets. It didn't make sense that Lazard really was never a good player. Lazard never had an 800-yard season with Rodgers throwing to him. And he had every opportunity because it was an ideal situation in Green Bay. He had Aaron Rodgers throwing to him. He had a number one receiver to draw up targets, to draw coverages from him in Devontae Adams. And he really had no great competition for the number two role for most of his career, yet he never posted an 800-yard season in Green Bay. Jets wasted $3 million on Randall Cobb. I know $3 million is not a lot by NFL standards, but it was still a waste. Jets went out, and there were other guys the Jets brought in from Green Bay over the course of the offseason. But just as big of an issue is that the Jets let this trade drag on and on and on. Jets never set any hard limits. Look, I still don't think there was anything wrong with trading for Aaron Rodgers in general, in theory, but you have to have some sort of boundaries here. Time-wise, the Jets, we know that the Jets were kind of tied up. The Jets were limited in what they could spend in the 2023 offseason, in part because the Rodgers trade took forever to get done. And the Jets did not have a new deal worked out with Rodgers, so they weren't sure how much salary cap space they'd have. There was at least one prominent free agent, Orlando Brown, who suggested that the lack of clarity in the Rodgers situation may have played a role in him not signing with the Jets. And there may have been other free agents where this came into play. Look, even if Aaron Rodgers is the best choice for your team, even if he's the best quarterback available, you have to communicate with both Rodgers and the Packers and say, because Green Bay needed to trade Aaron Rodgers. If the Packers would have been in deep trouble if they hadn't found a team to take Rodgers, then the Jets were the only team that was interested, and Rodgers was interested in the Jets because the Packers needed to move on from Rodgers to get Jordan Love on the field. If the Packers weren't able to get Jordan Love on the field, he would have entered the last year of his rookie contract and probably walked after the season. So Green Bay was in a desperate spot to get rid of Rodgers. The Jets needed to set a hard deadline. Just needed to say and make it clear to Rodgers, look, either you're our first choice, but if we can't have clarity on this and say this to the Packers as well, we have to move forward without you because other spots on the team needed to be addressed. And the Jets, first of all, really didn't show a lot of interest in addressing those needs. But second of all, allowing the trade to drag on essentially really, really limited what the team could do during the course of the offseason. And the challenge is, while the quarterback position is the most important position on the field of football, a quarterback alone is not going to win you games. I mean, look at what happened in Super Bowl 59. Now, I know 99% of the people listening to this podcast know what happened, but I don't know. Maybe there was somebody who was working or traveling who recorded the game who hasn't watched yet. So I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to give you a spoiler to what happened in Super Bowl 59. So, stop right here and fast forward 30 seconds. Okay, now everybody else knows that the Chiefs could not protect Patrick Mahomes. Their offensive line got annihilated in that game. That's Patrick Mahomes. That's a guy who's going to go down as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. And you look across the rest of the NFL. I mean, Joe Burrow had as great of a season as anybody in the league this year. He was every bit as good as Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen were. But the Bengals were not a playoff team because their defense wasn't good enough. This is not the NBA where you have a 12-man roster and you have 5 guys on the court at any time. It's not even baseball where you have a 25-man roster and 10 guys if you count both the pitcher and the DH on the field at any time or playing at any time. This is a league where you have a 53-man roster and 11 guys on offense and 11 guys who play defense, and you have role players up and down the roster. Even at the quarterback position, one guy only means so much. And look, Rodgers is one of the greatest to ever play the game. There's no question about that. But if you don't have an offensive line, if you don't have the pieces in place, you're not going to go anywhere. And there's no doubt the Jets suffered a lot of bad luck in 2023, losing Rodgers to that injury 4 plays into the season. But I look at that 2023 roster, and I look at what happened here in 2024, and I think it's fair to question how good Rodgers would have been able to be in 2023, even if he hadn't gotten injured, because the Jets did not put quality pieces on the field that year. And they didn't put quality pieces on the field because, first of all, it felt like they didn't feel like it seemed like they didn't feel the need. Second of all, because it felt like they just wanted to placate Rodgers at the expense of putting quality pieces on the field. And also because they weren't able to put quality pieces on the field because they were so consumed with getting the Rodgers trade done that they weren't willing to do the things they needed to do to expedite the deal. At some point you have to have a plan B, because if you don't have a plan B, everyone's going to call your bluff. And it kind of felt like Green Bay called the Jets bluff, and both in terms of the package they extracted from the Jets in the trade, but also the way the trade was allowed to just drag on and dominate the offseason. And I think the Jets really overestimated how much one player meant to the team, even one who was a future Hall of Famer at the most important position on the field. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, that's going to lead us to the second lesson. And sometimes it's a painful lesson. Many times NFL teams are not honest with themselves about where they are, where a player is at a certain point in their career. And honesty is the best policy, because you can lie to yourself in the offseason, but once the games start, there's nowhere to hide. And if that doesn't make sense, I'll explain what it means as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. If you're a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. Here's how it works. You post your job. LinkedIn's new feature can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach with qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Jay Glazer of Fox Sports reported yesterday that the Jets are moving on from Aaron Rodgers. The Hall of Fame quarterback will not return to New York for a third season. I guess it would really be a second season of playing since he missed almost the entire 2023 campaign. But the Jets will be moving on from Rodgers. A trade that will undoubtedly go down as a failure in every way imaginable. But from failures, sometimes we can learn lessons. Now, on today's show, we're talking about some of the lessons the Jets can take from the Aaron Rodgers trade, particularly the new regime of Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji. And I think that one thing the Jets have really struggled with through the years, especially under Woody Johnson's ownership, is honestly assessing things where they are as a franchise, what they need, and some of their own players. Now, at the time the Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers, he was coming off what was then the worst season of his career. The 2022 season did not go well for Rodgers in Green Bay. The Packers missed the playoffs. Rodgers struggled. He set statistical worsts in almost every major category when we talk about seasons in his career. And the Jets never really asked the hard questions because at 39 years of age, when a quarterback has his worst statistical season and when his quarterback shows major regression year over year, you have to wonder where he's at in his career. You have to wonder, is this a sign of decline? It felt like the Jets never really asked those questions. It seemed like the Jets kind of treated those as an anomaly. And to be fair, it was not set in stone that Rodgers was in decline in 2022 because he was dealing with an injury on his throwing hand. The team did lose Devontae Adams the previous offseason. Alan Lazard was his number one receiver. So there was an argument to be made that Rodgers could still play at a high level, but the Jets never really explored it. The Jets kind of assumed he'd continue to play at an MVP pace. They continued to assume that 2022 didn't really matter. And that was significant because even knowing everything we know now, if you look at the quarterbacks who were available 2 years ago, there's actually a pretty strong case that Rodgers was still the best answer available to the Jets. But here's the thing. If you evaluate that Rodgers is in decline, it kind of resets what you need to do because a Rodgers in decline can still be a competent starting quarterback. In fact, I think there's a case to be made that Rodgers, if he wanted to continue his career, could still probably be a starting quarterback somewhere. Not a high-level quarterback, but still a guy who's a starting quarterback. But if Rodgers in decline, he's not going to be able to carry the whole load. He's not going to be able to carry the whole team. He's going to need more help. And that goes back to what I mentioned in the first segment about, if you're dealing with a Rodgers in decline, particularly one who had shown that maybe he was losing some of his mobility, that his mobility didn't disappear after the Achilles injury solely. Even that last year in Green Bay, if you watch the film, he wasn't moving as well as he was earlier in his career. And that's a sign that, what we really need to focus on building up an offensive line. We better get good playmakers to help build up. We better do better than Alan Lazard at the wide receiver position because Rodgers can't quite do what he used to do. Instead, the Jets didn't really ask these questions. Again, the Jets just thought Rodgers was their ticket to the Super Bowl. And they pumped him up. They hyped themselves up. And the team obviously did not have a lot of success as a result. 2023 comes, and of course, Rodgers goes down 4 plays into the season. Terrible luck. I mean, maybe the big lesson from Rodgers is just how sometimes bad injury luck comes into play. But in that 2023 season, I don't think there's any way to argue the Jets had success. It was a team where everything just kind of fell apart. The offense was dismal, and we look at how bad the offense was. It wasn't just Zach Wilson. Again, there were issues on the offensive line. There were issues at the receiver position. And at the end of that season, the Jets finished 7-10. Now, what you could argue, and what the Jets did argue, was, wow, we won 7 games without Rodgers. Think of how good we'll be without Rodgers. Think of how good we'll be with him. But that was really a very flawed way to evaluate the situation because if you watch that team that year, you knew that there were lots of wins that kind of fluky things happened late in games. I mean, they got a big turnover against Buffalo week 1. Jalen Hurts threw a terrible interception to lose a game when they played the Philadelphia Eagles. They had a miracle comeback against the Giants. But even despite all that, Jets were one of the first 3 teams out of the AFC playoff race. This was a team that was sitting at 5-9, and then 2 of the last 3 weeks of the season, they played they played teams with top 3 draft picks. They played 2 of the worst 3 teams in the league in their final 3 games, and they won both of those games, but narrowly. So there was no real way to argue that the Jets were an impressive team in 2023. They were one of the worst teams in the league. They had a terrible point differential. They were frequently blown out. Again, they had some good things happen to them, fluky things happen to them in tight games. And then the last 3 weeks, they had a really easy schedule that, so they got a couple narrow wins, but it was a bad team. And it was a poorly coached team. And I think an honest assessment would have been that, you know what, if we're going to continue this thing with Rodgers, we better get better coaching in here, because Robert Saleh showed that he didn't have it. And Robert Saleh, the reports have come out that, he kind of quit on the team. He kind of felt like Aaron Rodgers was his ticket to having success. And he was not. And it just wasn't fair. And even deeper, Nathaniel Hackett, the fact that Nathaniel Hackett was able to keep his job after 2023, after an absolutely dismal performance. And it's clear, like if you watch that team in 2023, and if you read what happened with this team in 2023, Hackett kind of felt like Rodgers was going to do all the work for him. Hackett didn't seem like he really was really that interested in coordinating the offense, because once Rodgers went down, they did nothing to help Zach Wilson. Essentially, Zach Wilson had to be Aaron Rodgers and run everything at the line of scrimmage. It wasn't fair to Zach Wilson, who has a lot of issues of his own as a young quarterback. But the Jets didn't make a change. Again, the Jets saw this quarterback who is now 40, coming off a serious injury, coming off an Achilles injury, and they just said, you know what, he'll fix everything. It doesn't matter that we have Saleh as coach. It doesn't matter that we have Hackett as offensive coordinator. Rodgers is going to come in and fix it all. He'll be the solution. Didn't even get rid of Allen Lazard. Didn't even try and upgrade on Allen Lazard at the receiver position. It's just a big misevaluation. And the Jets made some, I will say the Jets did make some calculated gambles that made sense at the time in the offseason. They did bring in Mike Williams, so at least Lazard was pushed to the number 3 receiver, even though he was still in a starting role. They did bring in Tyron Smith. They made some moves that, like, even if they didn't work out, you understand why they made them. But in their heart, at their core, it felt like the Jets believed that they had a really good team that only needed a couple of upgrades, instead of honestly assessing where that 2023 team was and honestly assessing the flaws in the team, in particular the leadership, because that coaching staff failed in 2023. I'm sorry, you want to tell me that they won 7 games without Rodgers and that's an impressive coaching job? I was there. You were there. We saw that team struggle. We saw that team not play well. But the Jets don't like to be honest. And this is something that's got to change. And this might be the most glaring example, because to expect Aaron Rodgers to come in and fix the things that were wrong with the team that really had nothing to do with the quarterback position in 2023, Jets were asking for trouble. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll go to our final lesson, which brings us into 2024. It's when the Jets realized that they made mistakes at the end of 2023 that they got desperate. And desperation is never a good thing in the NFL. And we'll break down how the Jets were desperate and how it harmed them as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on the fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Again, it's $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Again, that's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. It sounds like the Jets are moving on from Aaron Rodgers. At least that's what Jay Glazer of Fox Sports reported yesterday. And on today's show, we're looking back at lessons the Jets can learn from the way they handled the Aaron Rodgers era. And I think this is important to discuss because it's very easy to pin all of the team's woes on Rodgers. And to be fair, there were lots of issues with Rodgers' level of play in 2024. But I think that just as deep of an issue is the way the team handled itself and the way the team made its decisions while Rodgers was here. And this all really came into deep focus in the 2024 season because I've kind of laid out some of the mistakes the Jets made prior to the 2024 season. Where we talk about their misperceptions on how much it was reasonable to expect from Rodgers. We talk about their ignoring critical issues that surrounded the team because they misperceived what Rodgers was able to do. But that was nothing compared to what happened in the 2024 season, because this is really where things just completely fell apart for this team. And I go back to a couple of major moves during the season, and it's a case where you need to understand what the time frame of how the NFL works. Once you get into the season, your team's essentially set. You might be able to fix like one problem in the trade market. There might be like one or two things you can fix, but you can't totally retool a team on the fly in the NFL during the season. The time to fix a team is during the offseason, during that brief like week and a half, 2 week stretch after free agency begins, and then if you get lucky in the NFL draft. And after that, there's not a lot you can do. And before that, well, if your coach isn't good enough, you can make a change, because the Jets should have made a change after the 2023 season. There was really not a strong argument to bring back Robert Saleh. I try and be patient with coaches, but Saleh showed that he was not a quality head coach. Well, the Jets let him come back for 2024. Or they let him come back for a little bit of 2024. They fired him 5 weeks into the season after the team started 2-3. They fired him 2 weeks after the Jets had a great win on Thursday Night Football against the New England Patriots. And it was a 2-game losing streak that got Saleh fired. And Jeff Ulbrich took over. And we know how that went. It did not go well. But here's the thing. And this is not a second guess. This is what I said the day the Jets fired Saleh. There was nothing we saw in those first 5 weeks of the season that was anything other than clear in the 2023 season. There were no flaws that suddenly emerged over the first 5 weeks of 2024. All of the flaws that Saleh showed during those 5 games were there in 2023. And the Jets could have addressed it by firing Saleh after 2023 and bringing in a new and better coach. But they didn't. They waited. And they felt like, and once their plan stopped working, they panicked. Once their plan failed, they panicked. And they fired Saleh 5 games into the season. And they promoted Jeff Ulbrich. Now, Jeff Ulbrich, for whatever it's worth, and we don't know like how much he ran the defense versus how much Saleh ran the defense, but I don't think anybody was complaining about Jeff Ulbrich in 2022 or 2023 when the Jets had ran a good defense. I don't think anybody was complaining about his performance as defensive coordinator. Now, we may look back and wonder maybe Saleh was really behind the defense when you consider how much the performance fell off after Saleh's firing. But Jeff Ulbrich was clearly not equipped to be a head coach in this league. And the idea that even before we've seen Ulbrich coach a game, this was a guy who in his entire career had like 1 game of head coaching experience. It was the Senior Bowl last year. The idea that this first-time head coach was going to be able to fix this team that was failing in this market with all these egos, with all these big names, with the media that the Jets have. This guy was going to be able to fix it on the fly. It just was not realistic. But desperation leads you to do crazy things. And Robert Saleh was not a very good coach. But if your options are continuing with Robert Saleh and moving on to Jeff Ulbrich, it's pretty clear Robert Saleh is a less bad. I'm not going to say he's a better option because he's not good. It's clear that sticking with Robert Saleh would have been a less bad option. Sometimes staying the course is the right move. Sometimes it's just too late to change. Sometimes changing in the middle of something, changing your leader in the middle of something just doesn't work. You change your leader before the season. You change your leader in the offseason. You change your coach in the offseason. That's something that could work. Maybe the Jets could have gotten Jim Harbaugh. But changing in 5 games into the season, bringing in Jeff Ulbrich, it just was never going to work. And, I've actually heard Mike Francesa on his podcast say, well, they should have fired Saleh and brought in an outside coach. You can't bring in an outside coach during the season. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. Panic led the Jets to do that. And then 1 week later, panic led the Jets to trade for Davante Adams. And to be clear, if the Jets were 4-1, trading for Davante Adams would have made plenty of sense. The Jets weren't, though. If the Jets were 2-4 at the point they traded for Davante Adams. The Jets were 5-1, it would have made sense. The Jets were 4-2, it would have made sense. They were 2-4. And it wasn't like you watched this team and you said, man, if they just had one more receiver, they'd be golden. They weren't. There were issues all over the team, including the coaching. This was not a move that was ever going to put the Jets in the Super Bowl. This was not, this was not a team that was a receiver away. You look at Buffalo, maybe Buffalo was a receiver away. If you put Davante Adams on Buffalo, they may have beaten Kansas City in the AFC Championship game. There were a couple other teams that maybe were a receiver away. But while receiver was an issue to a degree because Mike Williams did not pan out and Lazard is Lazard, and Adams did make the receiving group better, you saw it. Adams was good. He did not put the Jets over the top, though. And desperation led the Jets to trade for Adams because they felt it slipping away. And it slipped away. And there was nothing that could have been done. And at the end of the day, is losing a third-round pick that big of a deal? No, but it's a pretty valuable pick. And it's one the Jets lost out of panic. And when you think about building your team, these are the little things that add up. Because the Jets had already lost another third-round pick trade for Hassan Reddick. And the Jets also made a panic move in giving Reddick a big contract to come back, and Reddick provided the team zero value. The Jets actually would have been better off with Hassan Reddick never playing a game for them. The Jets would have been better off with Reddick playing out the season or not playing out the season, holding out the entire season, because Jets would have been able to toll his contract. They would have been able to trade him, and the Jets wouldn't have had to pay him a salary this year. The Jets would have saved cap space. But again, another desperation move. Woody Johnson felt the season slipping away, so he made a desperation move. You never make smart moves when you're desperate. Not in the NFL, not in any phase of life. So I think there are lessons to be learned from this. And my hope is that Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji take a look at some of the mistakes the Jets made, whether it's overestimating how much one player can do, even a quarterback with Aaron Rodgers' resume, whether it's best to lie to yourself. Jets, you have to be honest. Even sometimes the truth's unpleasant. Sometimes it's exciting to not be honest with yourself because you can sell your fan base on being Super Bowl contenders and get them all excited during the offseason. But when the games start, it's tough to hide the truth. And avoiding desperation mode. Never be desperate. Never try. If it's slipping away, it's slipping away. Don't throw bad money after good. These are lessons I think the Jets can learn, and hopefully they will, and hopefully we'll build a better team going forward. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.